I made sort of a relational mistake the other day. I was talking with a friend of mine about this channel, and I mentioned these videos that I'm making on Christian nationalism. And she said, honestly, I don't think I know what that is. So then I said, believe it or not, well, you vote that way. Now, I don't know what I expected her to say. Oh, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. Well, I thought about it later, and I thought, what was I trying to say? I think I was trying to say this. I was trying to say, you and I have both voted this way for most of our lives. And the reason we did it was not because we saw ourselves as Christian nationalists. Not at all. We wouldn't have even known what that was. We voted the way we did because we saw ourselves as citizens of the United States with consciences that were shaped by faith in Christ and a relationship with Christ. And so it's trying to combine those two things, the faith in Christ and taking our citizenship very seriously to try to vote in a manner that reflects that. And I think that's a really good impulse. That's a Christian impulse. And I still try to vote that way. But there's another impulse that we've got to be careful about that can get mixed in with this. And it's what I would call the Christian nationalist impulse. And that's quite different. The Christian nationalist impulse is something that I think if a person is born in the United States as a Christian and raised as a Christian, I think that you have some of this just latent, at least. I know that I do anyway. I'll speak for myself. I know that there's some of this just latent in me. And if I leave it unexamined, then I'm able to get hooked by certain appeals to that latent Christian nationalist impulse where I start to say, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense. That jives with what I think about America, or that jives with what I think about Christ, when really it isn't Christian, it isn't American, but these appeals work because Christian nationalism is a little bit embedded in most Christian belief systems. So I think it's very worthwhile to examine that, and that's what this particular talk is about. Now, I mentioned in my previous video that there's really two types of Christian nationalism that we can talk about, big categories. One is the capital CN, Christian nationalism, which is a movement, and it's a group of people with a fairly well-articulated ideology. I mean, there's different versions of it, but they have some things in common, and they identify themselves as Christian nationalists. They take on that label. And I'm going to talk a bit about them here in this video, but the main thing I want to focus on in this video is that smaller N, Christian nationalism that I mentioned, where it's a set of beliefs and values that aren't as clearly articulated, but they can be used to mobilize Christians towards a certain agenda that maybe Christians wouldn't go towards if it were more examined. And so I would call that the Christian nationalist impulse. Now, I want to talk for a moment, though, first about the capital N Christian nationalists, because it's very important. They feed into this impulse. And I think that Christians are hearing little by little more and more of the sort of messaging that the Christian nationalists movement is putting out there. So I think the easiest way for me to just show you what a little bit of how they talk is to let them speak for themselves. So this just for a couple minutes here, I'm going to play a clip from the guy who wrote the book recently that Christian nationalists are most paying attention to. It's called The Case for Christian Nationalism, and it's by a guy named Stephen Wolfe. And I believe he was a West Point graduate. He's a smart guy, and he's kind of winsome in the way that he talks to the point where I think a lot of people actually think that there's something to this, and that's quite dangerous, because if you actually listen to what he says, it's a little bit cuckoo. So I want to play a little bit of it and just let you see sort of the way that they talk. And I want to address then the difference between that Christian nationalism movement and this impulse that I'm talking about. So here we go. Let's listen to him. So this first guy you'll see is Joel Webbin. He's asking the question, and then Stephen Wolfe will respond in just a moment.
One of your portions in the epilogue, talks about being ruled by women, which I completely agree with you. I've said this on my show before, so I don't know, so that you're not nervous, I'll show my hand ahead of time and let you know where I'm at. But I've mentioned multiple times on our podcast that I think few things have caused more suffering than women's suffrage. So I I think that men should vote, and so that's my position with that. I don't think that that's there's any problem with that, but I do think that it's extraordinary that we really do live in a society where even just the implicit laws, right, the cultural laws that aren't even civil laws, but just cultural guidelines and directives are they're all feminine.
Yeah. So I mean, when I wrote this book, it's not just like an academic exercise. It's not just trying to be precise for my fellow academics or whatever highbrow thinkers. I actually want it to happen. Like what's gonna prevent us from being Christian nationalists? Well, what's to bring it in a Christian nation that follows kind of principles of Christian nationalism. And I think one of it is going to be, I don't think it could happen when women are generally kind of in charge and rule things. And that's because women tend to have, they're very empathetic. Mm-hmm. They tend to be more inclusive, and men tend to be more exclusive. And they tend to, yeah. So there's these different traits that you see between the sexes. And in order to have a Christian nation where where blasphemy is punished by someone who seems well-meaning and nice and smiles big, you're going to have a guy who says, no, you're going to jail. Right. I mean, or whatever it is that you're fined them. I mean, because I'm all for blasphemy laws, by the way. If you're going to suppress atheism, I mean, there might be some very nice guy who has a big smile, loves atheism. Like, no, atheism is crushed. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be tolerated. You have to have this kind of firm hand where it says, you just say, no, we're not going to do this. Right. And so I think that there's what I call kind of a gynocracy, which is a term that I didn't make up. Just broadly speaking, if you have very kind of feminine-led institutions, you can't have Christian nationalism because you're going to have a sort of empathy run amok. You're going to have untethered empathy.
So that's Stephen Wolfe. And I think it's important to know what he's saying. And he's a representative right now of the Christian nationalist movement. He, again, wrote this book that they're talking about. It's the hot book. He's like the it boy of the Christian nationalist movement right now. So it's important to know what he's saying. Now, the problem is that even though most of us, I think, watching this would say, well, that seems off, a lot of what people like this say actually can sound really reasonable. They use theological, historical, political terms that sort of hook into some things that we just sort of believe. And it's what I'm calling this Christian nationalist impulse. And it's dangerous if we don't examine that in ourselves and know how we're being hooked by some of the arguments that people like this are making. Now, to be clear, I don't think they'll ever get their utopia. I don't believe that they have the ability to rule. They don't have the power to rule. What they have is the power to corrupt. And I think that if they can corrupt the institutions of our society, that would be a win for them, because they view these institutions as being against Christians. They view these institutions of government and our civic life as being the enemies of anyone with true faith. They're run by godless, leftists, however they want to describe them. So they do have the power to corrupt. And so the way that I think is best to understand what could happen is that I don't believe the United States anytime soon would become Gilead from The Handmaid's Tale. I think it's much more likely that we would become some version of Vladimir Putin's Russia. The reason I say that is because Vladimir Putin has gained a lot of his power from keeping that Christian base supporting him. He makes routine appeals to the fact that he's the protector of traditional Russian Christianity, and they have to have him in charge in order to protect them from the godless hordes that want to come in and just do away with traditional Russian culture, Russian Christian culture. So they support him in his just completely corrupt rulership of Russia. That's the sort of thing that I think could happen in the United States. That's the danger of Christian nationalism. So what is this Christian nationalist impulse that I keep talking about? Whitehead and Perry, in their book, Taking America Back for God, put it this way. They say, simply put, Christian nationalism is a cultural framework, a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. So it's all of these stories that we tell that we find a lot of comfort in, and we see a lot of beauty in some ways, but they end up not necessarily being an accurate representation of America. Or to the extent that they are, it doesn't mean that it's prescriptive of what America should be in the future. Like, it's good to love your culture. It's good to love your history, but it's not helpful to just describe your history and your culture in such a way that it was unblemished back then, and now it's going to hell, and we need to seize the reins of power to bring it back to that unblemished sort of a past. That's a little bit what's happening. That's a little bit of what that impulse is that guys like Stephen Wolfe can sort of hook into in us. So for myself, I'm working on finding ways to talk about this Christian nationalist impulse that help me to know if I'm falling into that sort of thinking. Right now I have a proposition that works for me that says I'm operating in this way if I'm engaging in political thought, speech, or activity that prioritizes a Christian outcome over all of these values that I say that I hold. So if I'm willing to sacrifice truth, or I'm willing to sacrifice my conscience in order to elect someone or to advance a political agenda that will protect my rights as a Christian, for instance, or will work towards some laws that I care about as a Christian, if I'm willing to sacrifice my conscience, if I'm willing to sacrifice integrity, if I'm being asked to do those things, and I assent to that because I think it will accomplish a Christian outcome, that's when I know that I'm operating in this unhealthy sort of Christian nationalist impulse. Now, whenever I share this approach with people, almost 100% of the time, what I hear is something along the lines of, well, sure, I hate making those compromises, but I could never vote for somebody on the other side because they're so reprehensible. So what I have to say to that is, as long as we're locked in that whataboutism kind of a mindset, that just gets used to keep us locked into it and to keep weaponizing Christian faith, because people can use us to advance any agenda they want. And as long as we're grading on a curve and saying, well, our person is slightly less reprehensible than their person, they will always find ways to demonize the other side and show us just how bad they are. And they'll appeal to that just general human nature where we just kind of think that our tribe is better and we judge our own tribe slightly better. But we can't do that. In order to not have our faith weaponized in the way that it is right now, we have to be able to operate in integrity and make politicians earn our vote through their integrity. And if they clear that bar, then sure, we can talk about which party or which movement best represents the things that we feel called to work towards. But it has to be on that core level of integrity first. Otherwise, all of our work is for naught.